Hello and welcome to Conquering the JavaScript Interview, where I'm going to cover a ton of algorithms and data structures across this series to help you make your own luck, which, as we say here, is where preparation meets opportunity. So in this particular video, we're going to be covering another one of those fundamental tools that I've talked about that I'm filling your tool belt with. This little technique will help you answer more difficult questions down the line. So let's go ahead and learn this one here. You can call it whatever you like. Break it down, string breakdown, character breakdown, letter constructor, letter object, whatever you, character map, that's another really good name for it. Whatever you want to call it, doesn't really matter, but the goal here is going to be the following. We're going to be writing a function that takes a string argument and breaks it down to an object, where each property of said object is a letter from the string, whose corresponding value is how many times it appears in that string. So in our example here today, we have the word professionals. And notice unlike the previous videos in this series, we're going to start adding some little extras here and there, meaning we do have to care and be cognizant of casing, because capital letters do count differently in strings in JavaScript encoding than lowercase letters, right? They have a different value in memory. So we have to keep that in mind. We're going to start adding some more advanced tidbits as we go down the line here, but I'm still going to mark this video as for beginners. So we have a capital letter, professionals, and the output would be, again, an object who has a series of letters from said string or word or sentence or whatever that correspond to how many times it appears in said string, right? So in this case, S appears 3 times. That makes sense. O is twice, and so on and so forth. So that's going to be the goal of this function, because it will help us answer more difficult ones that you'll probably see, well, after this video in this playlist and series, right? Okay, so that's the goal of this particular function. Let's go ahead and set it up and get this thing rocking and rolling. So what we're going to do is, let's go ahead and call string breakdown. We're going to call string breakdown like so. I'm going to go ahead and copy this string professionals with a capital P and paste it as the input string for this. That way, when I actually save this file and console log something, we'll get some lovely output here above my fat head in the terminal. What we're going to do is, just like before, I'm going to prepare what my value is to return. So I'll call it the const breakdown object, or whatever variable name you want to use. I'm happy with it. Pizza, for all my students that come from my webinars, know what I'm talking about. And we're going to return the breakdown, and we're also going to console log said breakdown so we can actually visualize what we're doing. So we have our empty object prepared. It's what we're going to be returning. Make some good steps towards our goal. Now, like I said, we do have to care about casing here, so we do need to be cognizant of that, right? That's redundant, Luke. You just said we had to care about it. Why are you saying we got to be also cognizant of it? Right, so we didn't talk about this in my previous video, which was reversing strings in this playlist series, which, again, check the description below for links to the playlist and thing in the previous video and things like that, since I referenced it. And also make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and get involved in our Discord community. The goal, I should have talked about it in those previous videos, but I was setting up like very simple and basics in string reverse. But this is also going to be good to apply to those, or an interview setting when you get there, because to differentiate yourself from a beginner to a more intermediate or advanced developer, you start thinking about more potential edge cases. Some of y'all might be thinking, what about sentences that have spaces and punctuation and things like that? And yeah, we can build up to that, and I might even do like some more intermediate or advanced style algorithms where I revisit some of the more simple ones and begin thinking and adding edge case scenarios like early returns and sanitization and things like that. But I want to kind of build up to it rather than throw it in all at once and overwhelm somebody that's just getting into this field, if you will, of coding, right? So we're going to go ahead and make sure that before we loop through the string, we need to have it sanitized. So we're going to have something called I can spell, who said I couldn't, sanitized equals. We're going to take the string, and all strings in JavaScript have a native method called .toLowerCase. That is a function we're going to call, and on that string, what it will do is it will simply take all uppercase letters and lowercase them. So this is that first edge case we have to think about, right? Maybe if the interview's And keep that in mind. Like, it's not something you just apply willy-nilly. Like, in my particular case, I do want to have a count of all letters regardless of their upper or lower case, but there might be some scenarios or interview questions where they do say you want to count casing differently, so keep that in mind. Right, so the point here is we want to lowercase all the letters so we can get an accurate count. Whether they're uppercase or lowercase, it shouldn't matter, right? We just want a count of the letters' appearances. Right. So just like we learned about in the string reverse video, we know there is a for loop that can loop through strings and give us each character of said string. So we can say const character of str, and that way we're going to loop through each character of the string. And like I mentioned in that video, I'm a fan of the shorthands rather than doing let I equal 0, I is less than string.length, I++. If you're in an interview setting, like I've had a student do, especially during a couple years ago during quarantine times, they did a remote interview via Zoom and they were asked interview questions and they weren't allowed to open up their code editor or their IDE and write code to solve the interview question. They had them screen share in Notepad where you don't have autocomplete, you don't have syntax highlighting and things like that. So the chances of you forgetting to write semicolons or accidentally writing commas if you're under pressure or anxious can happen. Like there's room for error there. So I do advocate for using shorthand if you feel comfortable with it, as this is easier to write and remember than having to do all that, say, in Notepad or an actual whiteboard in Expo, right? So it's important to know your weaknesses. And I am kind of an anxious person, especially in like public settings where there's pressure on me. I can get very clammy hands and I tend to talk a lot when I get anxious. So it's kind of funny that I'm sitting here and talking to a camera anxiously. So, you know, I'm an advocate for these shorthands rather than having to write out traditional for loops. But there's sometimes you just have to, but in this case, we know we can use a for of loop to loop through each character. So the idea here is that we have to say, does this character that we're currently looping through already appear in this object? If yes, then let's just increment the current value it has, right? Meaning if it's appeared one time already, then increment it up 1 to 2. If it's not been here, then we need to add it to the object and automatically give it a value of 1 for its first appearance. Let's write some pseudocode out to kind of visualize what we mean here. So that sounds like a classic if-else statement. If yes, it's there, increment it by 1. If it's not there, then add it and assign it a value of 1, right? So if it's there, and I know it's going to be mad at me because that's not correct grammar, but who cares? If it's there, increment by 1. Otherwise, add it and assign 1, right? So that is a pseudo logic we're going to do there. And the question is, how do we know if it exists in said object? Well, if it has a property and it gives us a value, that means it's there. So in JavaScript, if we say in breakdown, this object up there, why am I pointing above my head? That object over there in breakdown, if we wrote breakdown and we did, rather than dot notation, so this is also something good for beginners to know, you're used to using dot notation inside of JavaScript objects, but there is another way, and a dynamic way, to access properties in an object that uses a square bracket syntax. So interestingly enough, you would think, like, you know, a lot of my newbie students out there, and you, the beginner person trying to go through this playlist, square brackets might be like, oh, that's an array. Not quite. In this case, it's actually going to be an object, and you can have string properties that you access. So this would be the equivalent of writing breakdown.lol. Lol. Those two are effectively the same thing, right? This has a property called LOL, and we access its value in 2 different ways. The advantage of the one on line 26 here with the square bracket string syntax allows us to use a variable, which is exactly what this is going to come into play here, right? So if I had a variable like character, I could place it in the square brackets and make it dynamic. So whatever that variable happens to represent should access that property of the object, right? So as a quick little demonstration, I need to comment this out before it crashes everything. Let's just head down here and do something real quick. So const test equals curly brace, test, and let's give ourselves a test property of LOL. And you know what? I need to console log this so we can actually see what I'm trying to demonstrate here. This is how this whole thing is going to work. We're going to save this. And okay, this coming back. Hold on. Don't worry about this sort of curly braces. The first log is curly braces that come from these lines of code right here, the 36 in particular. Don't worry about that. I'm more focused on the undefined part because that's how we're going to set up our if statement. So my current object has no property called LOL, so it gets an undefined output. And in JavaScript, undefined is considered a falsy value, which means if we put it in an if statement, it will trigger it to go to the else block of said if statement if it has one. So if it's undefined, that's considered falsy, aka down to the else if it has one. And that's that logic we're going to be leveraging to get to our else block to assign a property, to add a property to that object and assign it a value of 1. So if this thing did have an LOL property, then it will give us whatever its value happens to be, right? Which in our case is 5 from this little test object here. And if it has a value of any kind, if it's as long as it's not as long as it's not a number that is 0, which is falsy in JavaScript, it will be considered truthy, which means that will trigger our if block to say, oh, it does indeed exist, so let's increment its current value by 1. And that's how our if else statement is going to break down here, right? So I want to point that out for our beginners out there. So we're going to delete that test code, bring back in this loop, and actually write this logic out. So I'm going to be writing the following. In the current breakdown object, look to see if that character exists as a property and has a value. We don't have to write if it's not undefined, because undefined is falsy in JavaScript, so we can leverage some more shorthand code here. So we don't have to write if as long as it's not undefined. And we're going to say if it does exist at that point, breakdown at character should represent what its current number is, which means we take what it currently is and simply add 1 to it. Otherwise, we can say breakdown character equals 1. And that's how right there we're going to add a property to our object, right? And I just realized we're looping through the string. We should be looping through the sanitize. So get in the comments if you caught that and were yelling at me through this video. So yeah, that's the basic logic behind that here. And what this is doing right down here, let's go back and do another test. I should have done this more. I'll be doing this more and more as we get more advanced algorithms, and I do plan to make diagrams and things like that when we get to like array chunking and other more less hard to visualize via console log algorithms and data structures. I'll have to start making diagrams and drawings, but for now I can get away with console logs, and that is what development and testing is, right? Testing, you mean console logs? Debugging, console logs? That's all it is. Console logs all the way down, boys. Yeah, so let's go back to my test object here. Const test equals curly braces. And we're going to console log the test object. And what I'm trying to point out here is this is something that my newbie students also kind of don't quite get, because we're dynamically adding a property to the object and we're also assigning it a value. And that's all we're doing. So it'd be akin to writing tests. We're adding the property lols and we're adding a value of 1 to it, right? So if I save this and run it, we know that we have a blank object. This is adding a property called LOL in the corresponding code up here with a value of 1. Just did drag and drop with a value of 1, and that is what we're doing. We're simply adding a property and giving it a value all in one go, and that's what that else block's goal is. So we can take whatever word we have, if that character doesn't appear, add it as a property and give it a value of 1 because it's its first appearance. If it already exists, meaning it's appeared before, then take its current value and simply increment it by 1, and there you go. We've breaking this down. We've started it with like a small idea, make the object, make sure to sanitize it, loop through each character like we know how to do, wrote some pseudocode, and because again, this is going to be a recurring theme to this whole series as well, we have simply started with tiny baby steps and we worked our way up towards a greater goal. And that's something that's also very paramount in a lot of programming. You start with small, doable tasks, and before you know it, you're going to end up at your goal. That's how we do things, right? I had a university professor where I took like a basics of programming course that kind of sparked my interest in all this, and they said, how do you eat an elephant? 1 bite at a time. That's it. So let's take a look at it here. Does it work? Survey says I hit the wrong character. I hit the wrong hotkey in the wrong window. Hey, is a terrible way to visualize a console log, but yeah, it's there. P does indeed appear one time, R one time, the O is 2 indeed. F, yeah, it's only one F. I know how to spell. One E, which somehow is surprising. I don't know why. There's the highlight though, the S3. Simple storage service, AWS, anybody? Yeah, that S appearing 3 times is the key that we know this is working correctly. Everything else appears 1 time. But yeah, that right there, folks, is the string breakdown. And this little tool, I recommend that you get used to writing this from scratch on a regular basis because it helps answer some fairly advanced algorithm or interview style questions. So that about wraps it up for this video. Hope y'all appreciated and had some fun on this little journey we had here. This is going to be a very important tool to have in your tool belt. So let me reiterate, know how to write this and how to add edge case scenarios and handle things like that. Well, again, I'll probably be revisiting some of these and adding more advanced tidbits down the line. But again, I want to get y'all warmed up to the idea of how to think and code like this. So it's completely different from building full stack applications. It's a whole different style of coding, answering these interview questions. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, get involved in our community, and I'll see y'all in the next video.